Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. Um, Hope folks are staying safe and warm where you are if you're in the midst of our polar vortex. It'll get warmer next week. So welcome to the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative Winter Webinar Series. This is the second of 4 presentations in this series. My name is Jamie Ellis, and I work as the Natural Areas Coordinator at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and I am part of the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative Advisory team. The Prairie Reconstruction Initiative is a community of prairie practitioners and researchers from more than 30 organizations with support from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, working together to improve the practice of prairie reconstruction. Our mission is to build an engaged community of practice who work together to overcome uncertainties through all phases of prairie reconstruction. We envision prairies. We envision prairie reconstructions that are biologically diverse, ecologically functional, and resist invasion by non-native plants. We focus our activities on evidence-based tools and peer-to-peer learning. We developed a prairie reconstruction vegetation monitoring protocol and built a prairie reconstruction database. By pooling and analyzing data from many reconstructions, we hope to reveal pivotal elements that will increase the likelihood all reconstructions meet expectations. Our learning opportunities include both in-person and online events like today, where the prairie reconstruction community can exchange experiences and knowledge with each other. We believe these insights from both individual experiences and scientific investigation lead to our collective success. Right now, your cameras and microphones are turned off, and so if you have questions that come up during the presentation, you can type them into the chat. Teams also has this Q&A feature as well, but I'm not as familiar with that, so typing them into the chat or either one is fine. Andrew will be able to get to those at the end of the presentation, and then also at the end, I will go ahead and turn back on all the cameras and microphones as well. So this session is being recorded, and once we do some editing and add captions, we will upload it to our YouTube channel and let you know about it. And now I'm happy to introduce our speaker today. So Andrew Kaul is a plant community ecologist with over a decade of experience studying restoration ecology in Midwestern habitats, including work in Minnesota, Iowa, and Missouri. Andrew conducted graduate research on prairie restorations at Iowa State University, working with Brian Wilsey from 2014 through 2020. He then studied woodland and prairie restoration as a postdoc at the Missouri Botanical Garden for 3 years. For a second postdoc, Andrew worked at the University of Minnesota with Peter Reich's lab group, investigating methods of managing invasive buckthorn. Last year, he started his current role as a restoration scientist at the Missouri Botanical Garden, in the Center for Conservation and Sustainable Development. And today, Andrew will present strategies to promote native plant species diversity during prairie reconstruction. Andrew, thanks for being here.
Thanks very much for having me. Okay. Can everyone see my, I have to share my screen, don't I?
Yeah, go ahead and share your screen.
Okay. Everyone see my first slide?
I can see it fine. If some folks want to give a thumbs up and yeah, great.
Okay, sweet. Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me to do this, Jamie. I see I have some friends and colleagues listening in, so that's great to see. Yeah, so the talk today is some research I've been doing over the past 10 years. I know there's a lot of folks listening who have way more experience even than that. I was able to listen to the talk last week, which was about some sort of cultural and social aspects of prairie restoration and connecting with prairie. And it was an excellent talk. And this week's going to be a little bit different tone. I'm going to get into some of the nitty gritty of some experiments I've been working on, really focusing on plant species diversity. And so I have the two logos here because some of this work was at Iowa State when I was a grad student, and some of it is newer projects here at Mobot. And before I get into the meat of everything, I wanted to do some acknowledgments. When I was at Iowa State, I was funded by the Iowa DOT. Actually, Iowa has a really robust roadside prairie planting program, and they actually funded some research to test methods for prairie reconstruction. I was also supported by the Iowa Monarch Consortium, and I had a lot of help from some undergraduates over several summers. And then the other project I'm going to talk about today from Missouri was started when I was a postdoc, funded by a local nonprofit called the Bellwether Foundation. And that project I'm going to talk about quite a bit was developed in collaboration with several managers at Shaw Nature Reserve. So shout out to the Shaw folks. So all of my research, for the most part, pertains to these fundamental questions of how do we recreate lost native systems, and then how do we manage natural areas to promote species diversity. So these are kind of the two parts that I think of for prairie restoration. And I'll probably say prairie reconstruction throughout this talk, because in some areas, and certainly in Missouri, people feel strongly about calling like newly planted prairies reconstructions. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, not so much sort of restoring or managing remnants. So when we have this situation where we're trying to plant a new prairie community, there's sort of the initial questions of how do we get the species there we want, and then later on, what are the right management strategies to promote and to maintain those species. And of course, there are really important aspects of prairie reconstruction to be considered about the soil community or about the role of animals. But I'm a botanist, so I'm really focused on just how do we get all those plant species there kind of first. So when we think about prairie reconstructions, we often measure their success in relation to remnant prairies. It's sort of a unique system, we all know sort of globally in that we have, fortunately, these really high quality intact areas that we can use as a reference and as sort of a gauge to figure out how well we're doing. And I know a lot of planted prairies are not established with the goal in mind explicitly of recreating a remnant-like community. Sometimes that's not the goal. But insofar as it is the goal, it's nice to know how well we're doing in achieving that. So what we do know from previous research is that these planted prairies tend to look very different, actually, than the remnant prairies we use as a reference. They tend to have fewer plant species. They have different structure. They have different functioning. The spatial patterns of species diversity are different. Even the functional traits of the plants are really different. And there are whole clades that we're kind of missing for the most part from these reconstructed prairies. So it sort of lends the question of like, what species are we missing? And then how can we kind of do better when we are trying to recreate remnant-like communities? So my talk today has three main parts, three main projects I wanted to share with you. There are just too many different projects I've had a chance to work on. I couldn't pick just one. So I'm going to go a little bit fast through three different ones. And if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to address those, or you can email me, and I can do my best to follow up with that kind of stuff. So the first project is what we call the Prairie Retrospective, and that was a big study I did as a graduate student. They'll talk about first looking at lots of different prairies. And then the second one is a project I started at Shaw Nature Reserve in 2021, which is aimed at studying ways of enhancing the forb to grass ratio in an existing prairie restoration. And then the last bit is some new work I'm doing on seed mix design, and thinking about ways we could maybe develop better seed mixes that might more align with our goals. So just along the bottom there, you can see in the lower left, I've got the number of the slide if you want to reference that later. And then I have this little way of tracking where we are in the talk. So that'll help you to figure out sort of how close we are to the end. Okay, so this first project I wanted to share with you all, we called it the retrospective, which just means looking backwards. A lot of studies on prairies sort of track an individual site over time, but we thought it would be useful to sample lots and lots of prairies and then look backwards at how they were established and how they were managed to see if we could figure out what the most important aspects of the restoration process were for predicting the eventual outcomes. And so the big broad goals of this project were to sort of describe and quantify how in general are prairies being managed, how diverse are they, how invaded are they, what's the ratio of grasses to wildflowers, and things like that. So this is a study that was published in 2021. So there are lots of different things that can be important during the restoration process. We know that. And so this is kind of our theoretical schematic for thinking about the things that might matter. And in the middle here, you can see these are our response variables, the things that we measured as our measures of success. So how many species are there? What's the species diversity, which is a measure that includes the number of species as well as their abundances. And then mix establishment was basically the proportion of the cover of plants that belong to species we put in our seed mix. So we want our prairie community to be full of the species that we sowed instead of other ones. So those were our kind of three measures of success. And then we actually had 13 different variables that we thought might be important in predicting these restoration success measures. So of course, what's in the seed mix could matter, the seeding method, broadcast versus drilling, how the sites were managed after establishment with burning or mowing, the size of the sites and their shape, soil features, how the land was used before it became a prairie could matter, if it was agricultural use or if it was sort of a field used for grazing or something. And then we know that climate can be really important with these things called year effects, where the precipitation and temperature, and especially the first year or two after a new planting, can kind of determine how things go. And then there's this problem of invasive species, which we think of as being kind of stochastic because it's really hard to predict a lot of times what species will come in or how abundant they'll be, like what's in the seed mix or what disperses in. And how everything else goes can really depend on that, which is hard to manage. And then there's a lot of debate about the age of a prairie and whether we can sort of reliably expect sites to get better over time as more species have a chance to establish. So our approach here was to sample about 100 different prairies throughout the site of Iowa, or throughout the state of Iowa, over 2 different summers. And we wanted to sort of get information on all these different sites from all these different variables and use a couple of different modeling approaches to figure out what the best predictors were, knowing that any one thing could matter, but their significance could be different. So about half of our prairie restorations were what you would sort of consider conservation sites, areas owned by the Iowa DNR or maybe by nonprofit organizations like the Iowa Arboretum. And half of our sites were actually roadside plantings because this project was funded by the Iowa DOT, and there's a lot of prairie roadside plantings. And then we wanted to compare these restorations with remnants, which are our reference. So we sampled 5 different remnants, kind of representing a gradient of different kinds of remnants. So we had like a sand prairie and like a wet prairie and a dry prairie, things like that. So I'll spare you some of the details, but it's difficult to sort out 13 different variables and how they affect these different measurements. But for the most part, we found 4 of these predictors to be the most important. So at the bottom there, you can see I circled invaders, the proportion of the mass from non-native species. And that was by far the most important thing, determining species diversity. When there was lots of invasion, we had a lot lower recruitment of the species we wanted. And then we also found that precipitation, the amount of water in the first year after a planting, was important, as well as the composition of the seed mix, and then that establishment mowing treatment. So specifically here, this is our figure showing the effect of invasion on species diversity. So the x-axis here from the left basically represents no invasion. These are sites with like none of the cover of species we sampled were non-native. And then as we go to the right, this becomes 80, 90, 100% non-native species. And so in Iowa, a lot of the most common ones were things like reed canary grass or smooth brome. And what we see is this funnel effect, where at low degrees of invasion, your prairie site might be really diverse, or it could actually be pretty low diversity. So a site like this might be a site that's like 100% big blue stem. But as the sites become more and more invaded, we see this funneling effect where there's always fewer and fewer species. And you never see lots of different species in a site that has really, really high abundance of non-native species. And this dotted line at the top here is our average among the remnants. So you can see in terms of the number of species here, there are a couple of restorations that were approaching remnant-like diversity. So that's pretty encouraging. And these other variables that were important, the first one I'll talk about was mowing. So managers mow at different times and for different reasons, but a lot of folks do what we call establishment mowing, which could be either mowing the site one or more times the first year and or the second year. Usually it's the first and the second or just the first. And accounting for all the other variables, our models showed that there tended to be a couple of more species present in the sites where the managers use this establishment mowing practice. So it seems like that might be an effective strategy to help the sown species kind of establish. The other thing that we found that was interesting was that prairies that were seeded with more species in their seed mix had lower rates of invasion by non-native species. So this is a structural equation model, and so this negative number means it has had a suppressive effect. And then we already talked about how the greater abundance of non-native species suppressed the number of species we found in our prairies. We have this indirect facilitative effect where we put in more species, we got more species. But what we really found was it was mostly effective suppressing invasive species. So that was important. And then I mentioned precipitation was important. This might not be so surprising, but it was cool that it came out in our analyses. We saw the sites that had more precipitation, a wetter spring the first year, had greater recruitment of sown species. So irrespective of how many species were there, the cover of the ones that they seeded was a lot higher, which makes sense. Those first year seedlings are kind of thirsty and they need that water to be able to establish well. So this is my last slide from this retrospective project. We have a big table that shows a lot of different features of these different sites, but I just wanted to pull out a couple to highlight. So if we look at the number of species in the seed mixes, they ranged from 7 to 80. So that's a pretty big variation. And the average was around 38. And then if you look at the ratio of those species that was grasses or forbs, it ranged, like the grass to forb ratio ranged from 58% grass to 99% grass, which is also a pretty huge range. And the average was around 75%, so about 3/4 grass. And then when we were sampling these prairies, the average abundance of grasses was around 70%. So it sort of seems like across a lot of different sites, you get what you sow in terms of this grass to forb ratio, which is something that people think about a lot. Okay, so this is the next part of the talk. I wanted to talk about a research project and experiment that I've been working on for, I guess, 5 years now over at Shaw Nature Reserve. I started as a postdoc, and I think this will be our last year sampling this project. But as we were just talking about, a lot of our prairies end up being pretty grass dominated. And so this project was really inspired by the question, can a grassland be too grassy? So a lot of previous research on prairies has shown that we know over time, these warm season C4 grasses tend to increase in dominance. Species like big blue stem and switchgrass and Indian grass. And we know that remnants, they're variable, but they tend to have about 50-50 grass to forb ratios. And we know when these warm season grasses especially increase in dominance in our restored prairies, we tend to lose our sort of subdominant species, especially forbs. So what do you do with a prairie that's not necessarily invaded or of low quality, but it's really grassy and doesn't have maybe as many of the species as you might want in it. So yeah, so I think this is fair to say. A lot of our reconstructed grasslands are too grassy. This is a site on the left up in Iowa. They actually didn't put in some of the big C4 grasses like big bluestem and Indian grass, but it was seeded pretty heavily with side oats and little blue. And so there are forbs in there. They're kind of hiding at this time of year. They're in there, but it was really pretty grass dominated. And a lot of times we want our restorations to look a little bit more like this one on the right here. So what can we do with an existing prairie to sort of promote forb abundance and diversity? Is there a way to reliably manage a grassy site into having a greater forb component? I think the first idea that seems to make sense is to introduce more forbs with seed additions. And there's lots of studies that have investigated the effect of reintroducing desirable species that are missing from a community simply with seed additions. And what we've learned from a lot of different studies over time is that, in general, seed additions without disturbing the intact community are very ineffective. They don't do much. If you're just throwing seed into existing vegetation, those prairie species are deep-rooted and long-lived, and especially in productive, like wet prairies, it's a really competitive environment. And so it's just going to be really rare that you're going to get those seeds to germinate and establish new individuals. But if you disturb that community, seed additions can be pretty effective. So one of the groups that we're sort of most interested in targeting are those C4 warm season grasses that create what we call microsite limitation, which just means that there's no physical space for new plants to recruit. There's no gaps in the sort of plant canopy. And so we need to create those canopy gaps. So we developed a couple of methods we wanted to test to see if we could increase the forb component in this prairie. So along with seed addition, adding more forbs that were not previously in the community, we also added the use of herbicides and or mowing treatments to try to facilitate giving those forbs a chance to recruit. So since I found that establishment mowing seemed to be helpful in that retrospective study, we thought maybe it would be helpful after adding seeds of these forbs we're trying to get to recruit, we could do mowing afterwards and just create some opportunities for more light to get to the ground to help those young seedlings establish. And then we know we need to disturb the community, create opportunities for spaces for those seedlings. So we tried a couple of different herbicides. And particularly, we were interested in the use of graminicides, which are herbicides that only kill grasses or graminoids like sedges. So for this study, we used one called Fusilade. There are a couple of different ones. And for the most part, these grass selective herbicides are mostly used to control invasive species, but they haven't really been used much, at least in research, to test whether we can shift the functional group ratios in prairies. So we wanted to try to see if we could use some graminicide to suppress the grasses a little bit. And then, of course, we needed to compare that to another commonly used herbicide, which is glyphosate or Roundup, which is commonly used to kind of reset if you have a site that's in really low quality or it's really invaded. People use glyphosate a lot to kind of kill everything and start over. So we wanted to see whether this Fusilade, which was a little bit milder of a disturbance, would be better or worse than just using glyphosate and kind of starting over. So this was the design that we came up with. We have this full kind of factorial combination of plots that got seed additions or didn't, and then in addition got a mowing after the seed addition or not, and then we're treated with an herbicide or not. So we're able to kind of tease apart all of those different interventions and disturbances to the communities. So here's the site pre-treatment in 2021. It's pretty grassy. The forbs are there. Now you can't see them right now. There actually is a pretty nice native forb component, but they're just not the dominant species. So we looked at it, and in the pre-treatment sampling, I think we found that the grass to forb ratio was around like 76%, which is pretty much bang on the average from that other study. So I would say this is a pretty average restoration. And it's actually not super invaded, so it's a pretty nice site. But again, we just wanted to see if we could increase the forbs here. So we did quite a bit of work thinking about what would be good species to reintroduce or to introduce for the first time if they may not have been in this region in the past. And we came up with this list of 25 forb species. And I wanted to point out here, we really selected species that had pretty high conservatism. I imagine most of you are familiar with this concept, but conservatism scores or coefficients of conservatism are they're numbers rated from 0 to 10 that kind of describe how species are associated with really high quality habitats versus are more disturbance tolerant or disturbance prone. So species with like a 0 are like really ruderal weedy species like annual ragweed. And then your C9s and C10s are really highly conservative species you pretty much only see in really high quality intact areas. So all these species may not have been maybe the best fit with this prairie, like maybe the C10 of this delphinium, but there are some other really cool species in here we were excited to get established. So this is a pretty nice seed mix. So that's what it looks like. All of those seeds mixed in together. You can see there's a lot of variation in seed size. And we have a pretty good variation in the phylogenetic groups represented in this list with lots of different families. So this seed addition was done in January. This was like a winter seeding. And you can see, you know, it was cold out and we got snow after this. So it was nice to get some cover over the seeds after we put them out. And this was the first year after the seeding. So I'm just showing you here the effects of those herbicide and mowing treatments. So the plot on the left got fusillade after the seed addition, and then this plot was mowed. So I just did this by hand with a little weed whip. Obviously that wouldn't work at large scales, but I think it replicates sort of what a mower could do. And then on the right side here, this was a plot that was hit with Roundup. So you can see everything there is toast. It's all brown and dead. Whereas on the left, you can see there's still a lot of green vegetation there. So the fusillade treatment was a little bit milder, obviously, than using Roundup to just hit everything. And the glyphosate was done before the seed addition. So those were done at different times to sort of fit what makes sense with when you would use those herbicides. So this is just a quick figure to show that the mowing treatment did what we expected and kind of wanted it to do. You're hoping mowing will decrease the height of the canopy, so to speak, and increase how much light is getting to the ground, to those seedlings. And the mowing treatment did that. So it was nice just to measure and show that. So here's the plots 2 years after we started our manipulations. This is, again, one of those plots that was hit with the Roundup. And I just wanted to point out how short it is. You know, you can really clearly see this plot in the foreground and how the stature of these plants is really different than the surrounding matrix, even 2 years later. So it was really a large disturbance to the community. And this is 3 years after the seed additions. So this was our sampling from last year. And I wanted to point out here, you know, we sowed some really nice species at a really high rate. And if you look at these plots from a distance, they don't actually look that impressive. You wouldn't obviously note like, oh, wow, this area is a lot nicer. But it's just because these species take so long to recruit, right? They're not coming into bare ground. They're still competing with other vegetation. But a lot of them are starting to come in. So you can see here quinine and baptisia, some lead plants, some butterfly milkweed, a lot of species you'd like to see. But they're still pretty small. They're still pretty short because these are sort of conservative, kind of slow growing species. So I think this is sort of a lesson in patience and in the fact that you really have to look kind of closely to figure out all the species that you have kind of recruiting. It does take a while for them to get large enough to kind of be obvious. So we've been tracking these plots every year since 2021. We're going to measure them again this year, and that'll be at the end of this study with 5 years of data, which will be really nice. So I'm just going to present a couple of plots showing, in general, how effective these different treatments were. Just to orient you here, we have all 12 treatments represented here. The red versus blue shows you the effect of those seed additions. So the red dots show us the areas that got those 25 forb seeds added, or species added. And then we have 3 kind of columns here corresponding to those herbicide treatments. So on the right two, we have the areas that didn't get any herbicide. In the middle, these are the plots that got Roundup. On the left, these are the plots that got that application of the graminicide called Fusilade. So this is a measure of total richness, the total number of species we found present. And what we see is the seed additions were effective. We definitely increased richness, which is great. And then we also saw this mowing interaction where, in general, so within each of these columns, from right to left, there's a little bit of a bump up. And that's the effect of mowing after the seed addition, creating more opportunities for light to get to those seedlings. And we got a couple more species recruiting each time. So I would recommend, if you're doing those seed additions, maybe if a mow is feasible, doing that will help more of those added species recruit. Now, I wanted to show forb richness because this was sort of our focus in this study. And I just wanted to point out that it's basically the exact same trends as total richness. And it's because, in prairies, most of the species are our forbs. So these variables are really the same thing. They're measuring the same thing. So we had good recruitment of the number of forb species, which was the goal. And then this is just showing that those changes in the number of species were actually due to the species that we added. So this is richness of seeded species. And then again, you can see here pretty clearly that mow effect right to left. So within the control plots with no herbicide, there was a few more species when we mowed. Within the plots that got Roundup, right to left, there's a few more species when we mowed. So that was pretty effective. And then, if you think about it, we added 25 species, but here, we're only really seeing maybe 5 to 10. So that's not within the whole area. That's within a pretty small 1/10 of a square meter area. So maybe not all the species established, but I think adding 5 to 10 new species is a pretty significant increase at that scale. So that's pretty encouraging. And then it's nice to have those species there, but a lot of times they establish, but they don't really affect the abundance, right? They're really small and they're kind of just hanging out down by the ground. So what about all of the species there? Do we increase the forb to grass ratio in terms of cover? So both of our herbicide treatments were effective. If you look on the right, we have the control, which is hanging around somewhere around 5 to 10% forb cover. And then when we used that graminicide, it was increased to about 10%. And then the plots that we hit with Roundup, we really increased the cover of forbs. But I don't think that means I'm recommending that you use Roundup. Those plots were extremely variable. And the reason why we've been sampling them for 4 years is because they've been really different in every year. The first year, they were dominated by a native annual partridge pea. The second year, they were dominated by non-native weedy species. The third year, they were dominated by quick-growing native species that were not sown. And so every year's been a little bit different in those Roundup plots. So we did increase the forb cover, but I'm not sure that it was the kind of community that we were shooting for. So I think this is my last plot from this experiment. And I just wanted to show you this measure of conservatism, which you can interpret as what are the quality of the species that are there. Maybe you shifted the number of species or the cover of species, but are they the kind of species that we really are trying to find and are more indicative of a more remnant-like community? And so I just wanted to show that this seed addition of these pretty high C-score species has really significantly increased the average C-score of the whole community. And I think over time, as these individuals grow and get bigger, this shift will be even more pronounced. So that's pretty exciting. And I wanted to highlight, we were able to add this really nice C10 species in our region, Buchnera americana, and it actually came in surprisingly well to several plots. So yeah, that's a pretty cool way to enhance this site compared to what it was looking like a few years ago. So this is an ordination. So if you look at the left-hand side here, ordinations show whole communities as individual points. And so what I wanted to highlight with this figure is that the gray and the blue points on the left are the plots that had no herbicide or that had that graminicide called fusilade added. And so you can see they all kind of cluster together, which means the composition wasn't that different. The species that were present and their abundances weren't so different. But when you look at these red dots, those are the plots that were hit with Roundup, and they are really different in community composition, both from the other plots and from each other. So what that means is if you use Roundup, you're really creating a lot of stochasticity. you don't really know what's going to happen in that community, and it'll really depend on what's in the seed bank or perhaps what's nearby. So far, the conclusions from this story are that seed additions at a high rate can really improve forb richness, and we recommend doing other things to kind of disturb the existing community to create spaces for those forbs by suppressing some of those dominant grasses. So we think the graminicide is a promising approach. The effect of the fusaloid in our data isn't very pronounced, and we think that's probably because we did a very conservative application of it. There are other areas at Shaw where they've used this herbicide fusaloid a couple times a year and a couple years in a row, and those areas look really, really nice. They're super forb dominant, and we only did a single application. And so I think in the future we're interested in testing some really basic questions about the number of timing of applications to figure out how to use graminicides intelligently to kind of promote forbs. We found that mowing did aid in seedling recruitment, and so I'd recommend that if it's feasible. And then, the glyphosate plots reduced grassiness, but at what cost? It's not clear yet, even 3 or 4 years later, what the community is going to kind of look like. So we'll see there. And as I mentioned, we're going to sort of do some new work in the future, looking at repeated applications of fusaloid to see if that's more effective. And then we're going to monitor these plots really long term. These prairies are burned regularly. I think they did a burn on this site just a couple of weeks ago. So we'll see how persistent these effects are 5, 10, 15 years into the future. Okay, so that brings us to the last part of my talk. I wanted to talk a little bit about seed mix design. So just to shift gears again a third time. This is kind of a lot of how I think about prairie restoration in terms of what species we end up seeing in our restorations. So a lot of research will measure what we see in this green box, which are our reference remnant prairies. And then we look at this pink box, which are the restored or reconstructed prairies. And we compare these two things to look how similar they are. But there are some really important transitions that happen in between remnants and reconstructed prairies that determine which species show up there. And one of the big ones is the species you can purchase from seed vendors do not represent all of the species that you might find in a remnant community. And then similarly, seed mixes developed from commercially available species represent a small subset of this species pool that vendors produce. And I know a lot of folks are able to harvest seed themselves, and they're not purchasing seed all the time. So that creates other opportunities. But of course, there are constraints on what kinds of species you can harvest and in what quantities. And in my experience, most of the new prairie plantings are coming from purchased seed. So I've had opportunities to study kind of each of these different transitions. And today I'm going to talk about this middle one, which is sort of what goes into picking the species that end up in our seed mixes. So the key questions from this study are, how well do these pre-designed seed mixes that are sold by commercial seed vendors reflect the kinds of species that are in remnant prairies? Are they similar or not, and in what ways? And the second question is, how do seed mixes differ based on the way that they're labeled? There are a lot of really interesting ways that native seed companies market or label their seed mixes to sort of signal to the purchaser about what might be in the mix. We thought it would be interesting to test some of those things to see if there really are differences in seed mixes or what they are depending on the way that they're labeled or the way that they're named. So for this first question, how well do pre-designed seed mixes reflect reference remnant communities? This is a project that I worked on with an undergraduate actually in the summer of 2022. So it's through the REU program at the Missouri Botanical Garden. And we started by focusing on Missouri because we're here, and it's been really awesome working with the Missouri Prairie Foundation. They have a number of really high quality remnant sites and a really high quality data on the composition of those remnants. So they shared that data with us. And then we assembled a data set of commercially available seed mixes from around the Midwest. We wanted to compare these two groups. So we also collected data on all of the species we found across remnant communities and in seed mixes. So that was actually over 1,000 different species. And we collected data on the growth form of those species, whether they were native or not, their family, and some traits like when they bloom and things like that. And this is what I think is most interesting about this approach. This is another ordination figure. So again, entire plant communities are shown by individual points on the left here. And you can see that when we look at the whole communities of seed mixes compared to remnants, they're pretty separate. And what this means is the identities of species and the abundance of those species in these communities are pretty distinct. And that's perhaps not surprising, but what's useful is we can look at which species are maybe overrepresented in seed mixes and don't really reflect what we see in our remnants. And we can find what species might be missing, which we might call dark diversity, the ones that are typical of lots of different remnants, but never really end up in our seed mixes. So this is sort of the approach that I'm taking, and this is all preliminary data, but this is an approach I think could be useful for future seed mix design. So just to highlight a couple of examples, down here at the bottom, we see Viola sagittata scoring the most strongly low down here, which is indicating it's got high affinities to remnant communities, more so than seed mixes. And then in the opposite direction, we see a species like Rudbeckia hirta, which is probably in basically every seed mix, but isn't a very big component of remnant prairies. So it just sort of suggests species we might be over or underrepresenting when we're developing our seed mixes. And then something interesting over here, I highlighted Schizacherium, which is little blue stem, which is sort of in the middle on this axis that separates the two communities, indicating it's equally abundant in both of them, which represents that our seed mixes reflect remnant-like communities in terms of the abundance of little blue stem. So those are kind of like species that we're doing a good job of approximating. We were also able to look at which species were blooming when, and this is a really kind of cool figure that my undergraduate produced, looking at the number of species blooming throughout each month. We have remnants on the top and seed mixes on the bottom. And really the big result here was just that in remnants, we have a number of species that bloom in February, March, and April, and we tend to be missing those species in seed mixes. And other people have documented that as a problem before too, but we just showed it with pretty good clarity here that it's a big priority to figure out how to get those early blooming forbs. Here's the other question we were curious about with our seed mixes, which is how do they differ based on the way that they're labeled? So one way we can look at this, there's lots of different really interesting ways that seed mixes have been described or labeled to try to signal to the purchaser of what they might be getting. And one really common way of explaining what kind of community you've created is to say, oh, this is a wet prairie, or this is a mesic prairie, this is a dry prairie. So we coded those seed mixes and then compared them. And you can see on the left here that they separate pretty nicely. Wet prairies have different communities than mesic or dry ones. And then we looked at the species that typify each of those seed mixes, and we color-coded them based on their wetness rating. So red here is obligate wetland species, and you can see that they score really strongly for wet prairies. And the blue are the upland species, and they're really abundant and common in our dry prairie mixes. And so perhaps that's not surprising to anyone, but I think it's a cool way of demonstrating that, when a seed vendor is saying we're selling you a dry mix, they really know what they're talking about, and those mixes contain species that have high affinity to dry remnant prairies. And so I think that's a cool result to show that the commercially available seed mixes are actually made really well to reflect the communities that they're advertising. This is another focal question we had. Seed mixes can be really expensive, and price can be a major issue, especially when you're restoring sites that are quite large. And so mixes are often advertised as premium or diversity or maybe a pollinator mix. And then there are economy mixes or basic mixes. But it's not obvious if you're paying more money for that premium mix, like how much more are you getting? What are you really getting from that? So we compared, we grouped the species that are the mixes that are explicitly labeled this way. And what we see is in terms of the richness, those premium mixes across multiple vendors have about twice as many species in them, and they have about twice as many plant families represented. So I think that's sort of interesting way of showing the consumer, that's what you're paying for. This is the value you're getting from that extra cost. So that was sort of a pilot project that we did for Missouri, but the tallgrass prairie region is quite large, and I think this is a question that applies to the whole region. So we've recently expanded the scope of this analysis to include these 8 states, the eastern portion of the tallgrass prairie region. So I'm working now with collaborator Jack Zinnan at the Illinois Natural History Survey and some other collaborators of his. So Jack has assembled a remnant database, actually. They're about to publish this pretty soon. And they've over 300 prairie remnants and lists of all the species that are present across them. And so we're using just the highest quality remnant data from this data set. So we're going to rerun these analyses with 65 remnants across these 8 eastern Midwestern states. And those 65 remnants range in size from about a half an acre to about 200, with about an average of 25 acres. And across all of these different remnants, there are almost 1,400 species represented. And it ranged from about 37 to 260 species across the different remnant sites. And then to expand the analysis to include more seed mixes, Jack has also published a data set of commercially available seed mixes for the Midwest. And so we subset just the ones that are relevant to tallgrass prairie. And so we found 578 commercially available seed mixes that are labeled as having tallgrass prairie communities. And across those different mixes, we found 301 different species. So we've now codified all of these mixes based on those different variables. What's the intended goal? What's the soil type that this mix is supposed to be for? Is it high diversity? And so on. So we merged this new bigger species database of remnants throughout the Midwest and seed mixes throughout the Midwest. We've got 1,400 species, with 1,100 of them being unique to remnants, 31 of them being unique to mixes, and around 270 species being shared by both remnant and seed mix kind of communities. And so I'm not pointing this out to be critical in any way of the native seed market, right? It's incredibly important that native seed vendors are producing this really essential raw material so we can do restoration at large scales. But I do think it's interesting to look at what's in these commercially available seed markets to figure out maybe what species would be good candidates for including in future seed mixes. So I showed you that figure a minute ago showing that at least pertaining to the data from Missouri, it looked like we were missing some of the early blooming species in seed mixes. And this is a paper that came out maybe a week ago by Jack and some of his collaborators, where they did a really nice analysis looking at pollinator seed mixes and a portion of that prairie remnant database. And it just shows the same thing, that we're really missing these early blooming forbs in remnants in April, May, and even before April. So that's a really cool paper if you want to check that out. So here are the preliminary results from this new expanded data set comparing mixes and remnants. So on the right side in blue are those remnant communities, and the mixes are in red on the left. And what we see is there are just more species in remnant. And that those more species, that richness, comes from all functional groups. So they have more forbs, they have more graminoids, including grasses and sedges. They also have other things that you wouldn't see in a seed mix, like trees and shrubs and vines and ferns. And so they're different communities in some ways. And I'm not suggesting that we put those things in prairie seed mixes, but it's a part of explaining the differences in those communities. We also see that there are more families represented in remnant communities, and they have much higher phylogenetic diversity, which is the average relatedness of species. And it's just because there are whole lineages that are just not represented in the seed market. But this is an interesting result that we found, which is the average C-score was actually higher, or really they're about the same in mixes compared to remnants, which means in terms of picking species that are reflective of the kinds of species you see in remnants, our seed mixes do a really good job, right? We just can't put 200 species in a seed mix, but when we're picking the species that we can put in general, people are picking a really good representation of species that reflect remnant-like communities. So to me, that's really encouraging to see the similarity in distribution. So this is my last slide from that project. This is another ordination, just like the one I showed you a minute ago, just looking at whether the communities are similar among mixes and remnants. And we just see that remnants are pretty different, and mixes are also super variable. And then we can use this approach to look at what species kind of separate out these two kinds of communities. And it's just an interesting way of identifying where these differences come from. So we see that Elamis canadensis is really typical of seed mixes, probably in every one of them. And then there are other things in these remnants that are not in seed mixes, like a lot of different forb species. So the next steps for this project will include some indicator species analyses. We hope to produce sort of a list of key taxa that we might want to consider trying to include in future seed mixes. And then we're also going to be able to analyze prairies based on relative abundance data when we have it. Most of our remnants are species lists, but some of them have been sampled so we know the relative abundance of those species. And so we'll be able to do a sort of a subset of analyses, just looking at those higher quality samples. So here are my conclusions from these three different projects. We see that when doing novel prairie plantings and seed-based reconstructions, our models indicate that this establishment mowing is effective, that your top priority in establishing new prairie is controlling invasive species, because when they get in there, they just really reduce diversity. And we saw that seed mixes tend to be very grassy, and that you kind of tend to get what you sow. From that forb experiment I talked about, we found that seed additions aren't effective without disturbance, but when you do disturb that community, they can really increase diversity. And we think that the discriminicide is a cool new approach to sort of suppressing the grass component without disturbing the prairie so much that you're creating opportunities for invasion. And then moving forward with this seed mix design study that's still in development, what we've learned is that seed mixes really need to incorporate more early blooming forbs if possible. That's really difficult to produce seed forbs, so I think it's going to be a big project moving forward to figure out how to solve that problem. Some recent work has shown that if you use transplants, you can get a lot of those early blooming species established when they just don't come in well from seed. And we recommend, or at least I recommend, about a 50-50 mix of grasses and forbs to get a prairie that more represents what you might see in a remnant-like prairie. And then seed mixes with higher species diversity can suppress invasion by non-native species. So if you're able to, incorporating more different kinds of species into your mix can be a good strategy. Okay, and then moving forward, I have another project that's in its third year. I just wanted to briefly mention, we have a study also at Shaw Nature Reserve testing how to get conservative species that don't generally recruit well in prairies to establish. So we're testing whether the problem is that they have low seed quality or are sensitive to competition or dependence on soil mycorrhizae. So I just wanted to mention that project. I'm happy to talk about it if you're curious. And then this year we're actually starting a new experiment looking at establishment mowing. Because it does take a lot of time and effort, we're trying to see whether mowing once, twice, 3 or 4 times, and the timing of the mowing makes a difference, or if in fact mowing really does have a large effect in an experimental context. Previous study was really more observational. So those are some things that I'm working on moving forward. With that, I want to say thank you for your time and for listening, and I'm really happy to answer any questions you might have.
Great, thank you so very much, Andrew. We will definitely be following along as you continue your research. Right, as you recognize so many names, there's a lot of folks on the line today that are on the ground people planting and managing prairie. So let's jump into it. Sarah asks, going back to the forb enhancement, lots of questions with forb enhancement popping up. Right, so Sarah asks, how important is the type and or brand of grass selective herbicide?
Great questions. So, this is really something I absolutely can't take credit for. This is something that some managers I work with have already been trying and been playing around with. And so a lot of times I get my ideas from like people already doing things. Let's see if we can test this in a scientific way and publish it so that we can spread it more widely. Um, so I work with some folks at Shaw, and they use fuselier for a couple of different things. The other one I'm aware of that's common is called clethodim,
Mm-hmm.
and clethodim is useful for and controlling reed canary grass and things like that. Justin Meissen, Justin Meissen at
Mm-hmm.
University of Northern Iowa, I think gave one of these presentations previously and talked
Mm-hmm.
about some research they're doing, which is actually pretty similar, using clethodim to control prairie. I don't think we know the answer to that question, whether those different chemical compounds and their mechanism of action is really important. Those are some really key nitty-gritty details, the brand you use, application rate, when you apply it, how many times you apply it. So I think we're still at the stage of like early proof of concept. Can graminicides be useful? Do they really only kill the grasses and not have off-target effects? So I would say my experience with this project was the fuselier had pretty minor effects. Like we had a lot of grass the next year in an area I covered in grass selective herbicide. So, but yeah, TBD. I guess that's
Okay.
my unsatisfying early answer is we're going to have to test it to find out. Yeah.
Keep asking questions. Julia asks, what time of year did treatments, seeding, and mowing occur back to the forb enhancement?
Yes, the seeding was in February,
Hmm.
um, and the mowing happened in early summer. I don't want to say spring, but there are a lot of guidebooks that recommend when to mow, usually based on like the height of the vegetation. Yeah, I don't remember the exact date. I'm probably June. The point is, um, right when things are trying to grow and those aggressive, more well-established, larger plants, especially the grasses, are starting to really shade out the ground. That's when you want to be, doing your mow. You're going to be suppressing those taller species. So yeah, I would say,
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah. So Bob asks, does mowing mean just cutting and leaving the thatch lay, or cutting and removing the cut vegetation?
yeah. So yeah, if you're removing the thatch, that's I guess we'd call haying. Mowing and haying have different effects
Hmm.
on plant communities. There's some work that shows haying regularly over time changes the plant community quite a bit because you're removing nutrients and you're, not, excess nitrogen in prairie systems we know really decreases diversity because there are some species that are much better at capitalizing on high nutrient environments and they tend to dominate and outcompete everybody else. So haying would be different than mowing. I think we haven't been doing haying because I think that's less of an opportunity for some people. It's not as generalizable across all of the areas that are being managed throughout the tallgrass prairie ecoregion. Um, but I think haying is just as good, if not better. I'm not exactly sure. I can't say for sure because I haven't tested that specifically, but um, I think there'd be definitely nothing wrong with removing that biomass and selling it, which could be useful, or just reducing the total amount of nutrients in that system.
So this was a question I had. So Chad asks, what was your seeding rate? You mentioned that you had a high seeding rate for the forb enhancement. So do you have
Yeah,
like a seeds per
good
square foot?
question. Um, I want to say, oh gosh, yeah, I should have written this down ahead of time. I want to say it was
Okay.
probably pretty similar to what you would do for seeding a new prairie. Like 10 to 20 seeds per square foot.
Okay.
Um, yeah, I mean it was like that pile of seeds I showed you was where we applied to a 2 by 2 square meter area.
Hmm.
So
Okay.
this is probably, I mean, I would like to say this is a method that I wanted to be feasible at large scales. But the rate we sowed those forbs was probably pretty expensive at large scales. Um, so you don't want to seed at a really low rate and have an effect size that you really can't detect because of that. So yeah, I will let you all know. I'll send the paper around when it's out, and then you can look at the rate. But I don't remember right now.
Okay, Julia also asked, how effective do you think a mow-only approach without a graminicide would be?
I think a mow only approach. So the mowing is a very straightforward mechanism. The plants that are growing actively while you're mowing are the ones that are suppressed by that growth because they've already invested those nutrients. And species that are growing really any later than that, um, or any earlier, also are being impacted less. It's just like choosing what you're burning. So if you're mowing right when your aggressive C4 species are doing most of their growth, then you're hitting them more, you're suppressing them more than the subdominant forbs that might have an earlier or a lower sort of peak biomass. So I think mowing by itself is probably effective. It's just going to be a small sample size or a small effect size, and it's hard to detect those things visually. Like you really have to get in there and count everything to kind of notice, because we tend to notice the biggest things. But yeah, I think mowing by itself could be an effective way to shift grass to forb ratios. But I
Right.
can't say for sure. Yeah.
Well, we'll keep observing as we mow. So Eric asked, did you see any grass species recruitment after your glyphosate and fusillade applications?
Yeah. The graminoid diversity in this area is actually pretty high. So there are lots of native grasses that are hanging out in this area. Several different dicanthelium species or panic grasses. There's several, yeah. There's Sporobolus, there's big blue stem, there's Indian grass. So what we got mostly were 3 different species of dicantheliums that are kind of weedy and took over pretty quickly. But it's only, yeah,
Okay,
it's still early days. 3 years isn't that long.
right.
Um, yeah.
Okay, Jessica asked, how do you take into account the communities and states a prairie could be in, since in an ESD, a type prairie shifts due to management actions and invasion? What state and or community is the remnant prairie in? Is it in a state due to invasion and lack of fire and or grazing for too long? Jessica, I'm not for sure what ESD is, but maybe Andrew knows.
Could you repeat the question real quick?
Yeah, how do you take into account the communities and states a prairie could be in? Right, since in an ESD, a type of prairie shifts due,
Oh,
right, so due to
right.
management actions and invasions.
Yeah, yeah. So this is that important observation that there's no one kind of prairie remnant, right? There are lots of different, unique, and completely distinct, high quality, valid, remnant communities. And so, yeah, that's the kind of really important consideration that's really hard to address from a scientific perspective. This is sort of like site managers who know their site are going to be able to pick the right species for it, based on slope aspect and based on soil type. So landscape position. So I think there are some remnants that are in higher or lower quality, depending on how they're managed. But if I understand your question right, I think this is just a matter of thinking about the reference site that's appropriate for the area you're managing and thinking about what you're trying to manage towards, in terms of picking how many species you expect to be there, and which species. Um, yeah.
Okay, also along those lines, Jessica also asks, did you take into account the woody encroachment happening now in our prairies? I wouldn't count having a high amount of woody shrubs immediately as a good thing.
Yeah. Woody encroachment is a huge problem, and it seems like it's been more of a problem in remnants than in a lot of reconstructions. I'm interested in figuring that out. I mean, I know a lot of folks are struggling with things like sumac and other like weedy trees, roses and things like that. I haven't seen a lot of reconstructions, and we haven't in this forb restoration experiment seen a lot of problems of woody invasion. But I think when that happens, it's really more of a an approach that's less elegant and more just hard work do the removal, getting the right kind of machinery in there, or if you need to do spraying that's effective to control the woodies.
Hmm.
But yeah, I haven't done any specific research to look at sort of the interaction of methods for controlling woody invasion and looking at other things. Yeah, I will say we had a problem with Sericea in
Mm.
the form enhancement experiment. We
Hmm.
have Sericea lesbedeza cuneata down here. That's one of the biggest invasive species. And so we are tracking to see whether it's colonizing our different treatments differently um, in terms of like, did our plots with glyphosate create opportunities for Sericea to recruit? But yeah, we haven't really been tracking the shrubs as much. But I agree, we don't want a ton of shrubs in our reconstructions because they could take over. And
So Wendy comments 50-50 mix is best. I assume that's 50 grass, 54, but CRP and CREP does not allow anywhere near this. And then she wonders aloud, how can NRCS change the mix ratio? Um, Maybe we'll have to save that question for NRCS person, unless you have an inside track, Andrew,
oh
to,
well,
to
yeah. So
NRCS.
that's one of the big caveats of my research approach, which is I'm interested in this very idealistic concept of doing prairie restoration to create, ideally very diverse, very remnant-like communities. But there are lots of reasons we plant prairies having to do with wildlife habitat and soil stabilization and stormwater management. And we use prairie species for those, but it's not really fair to compare, a CRP plot to a remnant and say this failed, right? Like that area is probably doing what it was designed to do. And grasses recruit really reliably. They're really cheap. So, there's a lot of valid and good uses for high grass mixes. So yeah, I don't mean to be critical of that at all when it's appropriate. But what you're pointing out is a lot of those NRCS sponsored programs are not funding or designed to create prairies that are approaching remnant-like communities. Maybe we want that. That's something to think about. But but yeah, I don't want to steal the thunder. But my graduate advisor has an experiment he's about to publish a couple of papers
Mm.
on, and he varied seed mixes to from 0% grass, 100% forb, all the way up to the other way around, 100% grass, 0% forb at every 10% interval. So he planted, 90-10, 80-20, all the way up and down to look at the best ratio. And he has a couple of different cool papers coming out on that. But really, I think broadly what we see is somewhere in the middle is where you get communities with greater diversity and with things like greatest variation in the bloom dates of flowers to provide the greatest niche for pollinators, for example. So I think whenever you can, just getting the grass to forb ratio to be more equal, if you can afford it, that's I think good for diversity.
Okay, there's some, in the interest of time, wherein folks are dropping off. I thank everybody for sticking around and Andrew, thank you for your time. Um, I'm gonna skip down to another question, right? When enlarging a remnant, I've noticed that the grasses and lower quality plants move into the opened areas much faster than high quality plants. Would mowing these areas or using other methods help?
Um, yeah, I think that's an interesting question of
Hmm.
what species are the best at dispersing quickly, moving quickly. So that's kind of getting into growth strategies, right? There are plants that produce a lot of seeds or seeds that have wind dispersal abilities. Think about dandelions. And there are some species that grow really slowly and are, stress tolerant, and maybe they create a couple of fruits, but they're really, really large seeds. So yeah, your weedy species, your ruderal species, whether they be native or non-native, are going to be the first ones to get over to those new areas. I think whenever you can shift the community towards the intended goal by doing introductions with transplants or with seeds, that's always good. And if you have a community that's becoming dominated by plants that are not your target, if you mow before they set seed, then you're preventing those species from creating a seed bank. So that's always good. Maybe you have grasses that are not the ones you want there, but you can mow off the seed heads every year, and you're not going to probably get rid of those grasses, but you might prevent them from creating a seed bank that's so large that you can never manage it towards something else.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for your time and expertise today. We look forward to your research publications coming out and further conversations. And of course, those great research continuing to come from Brian Wilsey as well, and all our friends and colleagues on the line. Thank you. Next week, we'll have another webinar at the same time to talk about the Prairie Reconstruction database. Ian Lane will be here with us. And then in 2 weeks, Tyler Bassett from the Michigan Natural Features Inventory will once again be talking about Prairie Reconstruction. So everyone stay safe and stay warm. Andrew, thanks again, and have a great day.